Everyone loves to call Gus Fring a criminal mastermind. Calm, meticulous, surgical. But if he was truly the smartest man in the room, why did he keep making decisions that would get any real kingpin killed before lunch? Let's start with the most obvious crack in the myth. The man invests millions into a state-of-the-art super lab, hires a Nobel-level chemist, and then somehow believes he can control the walking disaster known as Walter White, as if he's just another employee on payroll. Genius behavior, right? And it gets better. That famous $3 million for 3 months deal? A flawless business move, right up until it suddenly becomes a two-way split because Gus refuses to pay Jesse a dime. The man who supposedly cares only about efficiency now risks his entire operation just to cheap out on labor. Brilliant strategy. Then there's the part where he threatens Walt's family, as if provoking a man whose ego is a weapon isn't the most suicidal decision he could make. Or the time he protected 2 reckless dealers instead of simply removing the liabilities staring directly at his face. So much for caution. So much for discipline. For a figure worshipped as the ultimate chess player, Gus doesn't just make mistakes, he makes catastrophic ones. Mistakes that expose, unravel, and ultimately destroy the empire he built brick by brick. So today, let's pull back the curtain and ask the question no one wants to face. Was Gus Fring truly a mastermind, or was the myth smarter than the man? Gus Fring's empire prides itself on efficiency, precision, and a tasteful lack of blood on the walls, yet somehow manages to fall apart the moment a high school chemistry teacher with an ego problem and a burnout with a talent for self-destruction wander through the loading docks. The show repeatedly presents Gus as the paragon of cold rationality, the antidote to the Tuco-style tantrum-driven management style, the man who can turn a cartel into a spreadsheet. But peel back the polished veneer, and a different truth emerges. From the moment he uttered the words $3 million for 3 months, Gus set in motion a series of decisions so short-sighted, so riddled with double standards and selective logic, that one wonders whether the laundry chemicals were affecting his brain function. The fabled $3 million offer is a perfect example. Initially marketed as the grand prize for a single professional cook, it becomes an awkward two-way split the moment Jesse Pinkman enters the picture. The justification? Gus never wanted Jesse and would not pay a cent more for him. This is presented as savvy business calculus, but in practice, it simply confirms Jesse's earliest suspicion, uttered before the lab was even warmed up, that the whole deal was a swindle wearing an expensive suit. When the original offer is designed for Walt and Gail, and the numbers magically shrink the instant Gail exits stage left, it becomes clear that what is being sold as rigid business principle is actually just selective frugality. Gus will invest millions in underground architecture, surveillance, and artisanal kill rooms, but a second cook? Absolutely not. Apparently, even criminal CEOs suffer from payroll anxiety. This numerical sleight of hand is especially amusing because it is not even the complaint Jesse eventually makes. His anger is not rooted in a demand for equal wages. It arises from the glaring discrepancy between the gigantic fortune the empire produces and the sliver he receives. Now, in a conventional workplace, this is indeed an idiotic point. Employees who contribute labor but shoulder none of the overhead do not normally demand a shareholder-level cut. Jesse, however, is not comparing his salary to that of a typical employee. He is comparing it to his previous arrangement, one where he and Walt controlled everything, paid for everything, risked everything, and reaped everything. He is not wrong to notice that in Gus's gleaming utopia of stainless steel and round-the-clock laundry steam, his job has been reduced to that of highly compensated machinery. The irony is exquisite. The only time a drug empire offers Jesse a stable, lucrative, entirely safe existence, he despises it for being too corporate. In a world where meth cooks normally dodge bullets, chain smoke stress, and pray their glassware doesn't explode, Jesse enjoys salaried serenity and hates every minute of it. The problem, of course, is not the dollar amount. It is the loss of power. The show underlines this with surgical precision in the aptly titled episode Kafkaesque, where Jesse describes his job as soul-deadening and corporate, because nothing captures the spirit of Kafka quite like a drug addict complaining that his meth lab shift feels like a middle management purgatory. It is one of the few times the show explicitly spells out what motivates Jesse: control, autonomy, and the illusion that he is shaping his own world. Gus's empire offers none of that. Walt's pep talk about being extraordinarily well compensated evaporates on contact because money was never the issue. Pride was. So Jesse pivots back to the only domain where he once had agency: selling stolen product behind Gus's back. The fact that the scheme is idiotic hardly matters. It restores the illusion of power. An illusion is currency in Jesse's world. Gus's attempt to remedy this later by staging a fake heist and artificially promoting Jesse is one of his more inspired manipulations, granting Jesse the feeling of usefulness without the bother of actually being useful. It is the closest Gus ever gets to understanding human psychology, and naturally, it is too little, too late. Still, it is difficult not to marvel at the irony. The same Jesse dismissed as a low-life junkie is the one Gus refuses to pay, but later attempts to mold into a trusted employee. Gail, by contrast, is the dream employee every tyrannical businessman wishes HR could produce. Dutiful, eager, scientifically literate, and devoid of ambition beyond teacup collecting and stargazing. Gail is the human embodiment of a lab manual. One could leave him alone in a meth lab for 3 weeks and return to find every surface spotless, every instrument calibrated, and a fresh pot of herbal tea brewing in the corner. Yet Gus, in an encore performance of questionable managerial instincts, decides the correct long-term plan is to let Walt train Gail so Gail can eventually replace Walt. This logic rests on the assumption that a man who prides himself on hyperpurity will happily teach another chemist to produce his life's work, knowing that this knowledge ensures his own expendability. Even accountants with spreadsheets could see the flaw here. Walt follows the logic to its natural conclusion. The moment Gail can cook independently, Walt will be removed from the payroll, forcefully if necessary. All of this raises the question that has haunted fans for years. If Gus is supposedly the most competent kingpin in television history, why does he never simply record Walt and Jesse cooking? Why not film every flourish, every drop rate change, every temperature adjustment, and hand the footage to Gail, or any chemist willing to read subtitles? Many viewers propose this as an airtight solution, yet it collapses the moment one applies even a small amount of scientific reasoning. Walt's process is not a cooking show recipe. It is a dynamic system requiring constant adaptation. A recording cannot diagnose a bad batch of precursor chemicals, cannot detect humidity fluctuations, cannot troubleshoot malfunctions, and cannot make the subtle judgment calls Walt routinely makes without even thinking. This is why Walt's verbal demolition of Victor, moments before Gus turns Victor into an OSHA violation, rings so true. Victor believes that shadowing Walt for a few weeks qualifies him as head chef. Walt calmly asks him how he plans to respond when the methylamine is compromised, or when the atmosphere shifts, or when impurities appear. Victor has no answers. Neither would any cook relying on a video. It is extraordinary that in a story where criminal masterminds possess fleets of lawyers, fleets of trucks, fleets of assassins, and enough industrial infrastructure to launch a private space program, none of them grasp the simplest principle of science. Theory matters. To borrow the words of an actual chemist quoted in the discussion, anyone can push buttons. Only a chemist can understand what the buttons do. Walt's genius is not merely in following a recipe. It is knowing why the recipe works and adjusting it when reality refuses to cooperate. Gail comes closest to matching this ability, but even he hovers in the high 90s, while Walt reaches the mythical 99%. Jesse, naturally, hovers beneath them both, not because he lacks talent, but because he lacks theory. Jesse is the culinary equivalent of a gifted line cook, exceptional at executing a perfected dish, less effective at inventing one. Yet it would be foolish to dismiss Jesse as incompetent. The moment he steps into the cartel's cavernous facility in Mexico, surrounded by more degrees than a university faculty lounge, he outperforms every one of their polished professionals. They stand there, holding clipboards in condescension, while Jesse, who flunked chemistry and whose high school teachers probably used his essays as cautionary tales, produces meth of such quality that the cartel chemists look as though they've just witnessed the burning bush. They are not incompetent. They are simply technicians following a formula, while Jesse has absorbed the quirks and instincts of someone who cooked under a genius. The cartel lab's poor sanitation standards alone would have introduced impurities no matter how carefully they followed the script. Walt and Gail maintain their labs like surgical theaters. The cartel lab resembles a poorly ventilated garage. It is no wonder Jesse's batch, even without hitting Walt's legendary peak, surpasses anything they have ever produced. One might ask, how did Jesse, a man once known for his Chili Pea brand of questionable sludge, evolve into the second best meth cook in North America? The answer lies not in formal education, but in exposure, repetition, and unexpected talent. Jesse shows, throughout the narrative, flashes of genuine ingenuity. The train heist scheme, the magnet plan, the ability to improvise in dangerous situations. Beneath the haze of drugs and self-loathing exists a mind sharp enough to grasp complicated systems once properly motivated. He is not a chemist, but he is capable of precision. His story about the wooden box he once crafted reveals a truth about his character. When he devotes himself to a task, he can pursue craftsmanship with near monastic dedication. Walt recognizes this, perhaps even before Jesse does, which is why he becomes not just a partner, but a project, someone Walt can mold, mentor, and manipulate in equal measure. Their dynamic is the dark mirror of a teacher discovering a talented student and slowly strangling the joy out of him. This raises the perennial debate. Was Jesse ever truly as good as Walt? Walt insists at times that Jesse can cook just as well, but his credibility is dubious. Walt lies whenever it serves him, and telling Jesse he matches the master's purity costs Walt nothing while keeping Jesse compliant. Realistically, Jesse's purity numbers hover around 95 or 96. Impressive, but not the 99 plus Walt achieves. Whether this last 3% truly matters is up for debate. Users on the street cannot detect the difference, and purity beyond 90 makes little functional difference except in yield. But purity is Walt's religion, and he is its sole ordained priest. Jesse, at best, is a competent deacon, skilled, reliable, and wholly dependent on the sacred text provided by his mentor. The irony, of course, is that when Jesse returns to cooking under duress, shackled by neo-Nazis, surrounded by filth, grieving and broken, his product is still miles better than anything Todd ever manages. Todd's attempts to imitate Walt are an exercise in confident mediocrity. His product slips into the 70s, barely recognizable as blue. When Jesse returns and hits the mid-90s again, the dealers hail it as better than ever, a phrase ordinary users employ loosely and unreliably. If the most recent product they tasted was Todd's chalky disappointment, anything north of 80% would feel like a religious experience. Jesse's batch, by comparison, is a revelation. But the entire conversation about purity obscures a larger truth. The notion that Gus Fring ever needed Walt in the first place is deeply questionable. Gail alone was producing meth with purity in the low 90s, good enough to yield enormous profits, and was the ideal employee. He posed no threat, harbored no ambition, and would never in a million years question why a drug lord needed a laundry business. If caution were Gus's guiding principle, as the myth insists, he would have kept Gail as the lead cook from the beginning, replacing Walt entirely. Instead, he gambles on a volatile genius whose ego requires aerospace-grade maintenance and whose moral compass consistently points towards self-immolation. This, allegedly, is what cautious masterminds do. The flaws in Gus's character become even more apparent when examining his reaction to Walt and Jesse killing two street dealers. These two men, low-level, impulsive, utterly interchangeable, should not have mattered. They were liabilities the moment they saw Gus's face. Yet Gus responds with disproportionate fury, treating their deaths as a personal affront. A genuinely cautious kingpin would have quietly celebrated the removal of two reckless employees capable of drawing police attention. Instead, Gus allows pride to eclipse pragmatism, transforming a simple cleanup opportunity into the trigger for full-scale war. This miscalculation rivals only his later decision to threaten Walt's family, a move guaranteed to activate Walt's most destructive instincts. Gus, a man who once seemed to possess infinite patience, suddenly behaves like someone auditioning for the role of petty tyrant of the year. The list of managerial blunders continues. Gus allows 3 people to know about the superlab, then 4, then 5, and yet maintains the fiction that secrecy is paramount. If secrecy were truly the priority, expanding the workforce to increase production would be unthinkable. Yet the suggestion of hiring a 3rd cook lingers like an unresolved equation. With Walt, Jesse, and Gail working in shifts, production could theoretically increase without compromising quality. Instead, Gus opts for the 2-man arrangement, likely because the lab itself limits output rather than manpower. Still, even this practical explanation fails to address the core contradiction. Gus removes Gail, reducing the number of cooks without reducing the number of people aware of the lab. Gail's termination serves no practical purpose other than to placate Walt's ego and maintain the illusion of managerial control. The question of why Gus never adopted a night-and-day cooking rotation reveals yet another inconsistency. If the lab's capacity were the limiting factor, additional personnel would not increase yield. But if the limitation were human labor, increasing staff would be logical. The show leans on the idea that only Walt and Jesse possess the skills to operate the lab efficiently, yet repeatedly demonstrates that Jesse alone can run it, Gail alone can run it, and even Victor believes he can run it. The show's internal logic around labor efficiency fluctuates according to dramatic need rather than actual business sense. If one were to redesign Gus's strategy with the benefit of hindsight and a basic understanding of risk management, the first change would be obvious. Avoid Walt White at all costs. Every sign points to him as a walking disaster. Emotional instability, legal vulnerability, an appetite for chaos, and a knack for turning manageable problems into apocalyptic ones. Any risk-averse businessman would escort Walt out of the building the moment he began making demands. Instead, Gus becomes ensnared in a bizarre dance of power, pride, and false assumptions about loyalty. Walt's value lies solely in his formula, and even that could have been purchased, replicated, or reverse engineered with far fewer corpses involved. The second strategic adjustment: eliminate problematic dealers early and decisively. When Walt and Jesse's moral outrage over the death of a child destabilizes the operation, Gus responds with confusion rather than foresight. The existence of child-murdering employees is not simply a public relations concern. It is a liability capable of detonating the entire enterprise. A cautious leader would have removed them quietly, not defended them. A third adjustment: do not threaten Walt's family. Nothing in Walt's psychological profile suggests that intimidation yields obedience. It yields retaliation. Walt is the type of man who will burn down a kingdom to avoid showing weakness. Threatening his family is tantamount to daring him to turn the superlab into Chernobyl. And if one insists on keeping Walt employed despite all red flags, the next best move is simple. Pay him up front for the recipe. Offer a fortune, record a few demonstration cooks, and construct a new team under Gail's supervision. Walt could be permitted to retire peacefully with a stack of unmarked bills, avoiding the entire chain reaction that ultimately leads to half of Albuquerque being reduced to rubble. But Gus, in a rare moment of sentimentality, values Walt's live performance more than the reproducibility of the product. It is this misplaced artistic preference, this belief that meth of the highest purity requires its Michelangelo present at the canvas, that ultimately seals his fate. At the core of every argument about method, purity, hierarchy, and payroll lies the same lesson. Knowledge is not easily transferable, and genius cannot be reduced to an instructional video. Walt's brilliance is not merely a matter of precision, but of interpretation. He reads chemical reactions like a musician reads sheet music. He adjusts tempo, tone, and rhythm in real time. Jesse, by contrast, is a virtuoso of imitation, a brilliant performer of someone else's composition. Gail is the ideal student, diligent and talented, but lacking the spark of innovation. Todd is the child banging on the piano, confident and oblivious. And Gus, supposedly the brilliant manager, is the man who mistakes working around genius for controlling it. The empire that should have lasted decades instead collapses because its architect cannot recognize the difference between hiring talent and managing it. He insists on treating Walt and Jesse like interchangeable components in a machine that demands artistry. He demands loyalty, yet refuses to cultivate it. He values secrecy, yet repeatedly expands the circle of knowledge. He claims caution, yet makes decisions ruled by pride. In the end, the empire he builds is immaculate, efficient, terrifying, and unsustainably fragile. A single chemist with a grudge brings the entire structure down. And that, more than any murder, heist, betrayal, purity percentage, or glittering blue crystal, is the most perfect irony the show ever offers.